I'm Elise Hammond, 52 years old, and the HOA fined me $2,000 for hosting a dinner for my late husband's Marine unit. They called it an unauthorized assembly, as if the men he bled with in Fallujah were throwing some kind of riot in my backyard. Karen, the HOA president, left a typed letter in my mailbox with a citation stapled to it and a note scribbled at the bottom. This neighborhood deserves quiet dignity, not military theatrics. The day that citation arrived, I was setting the table for 9 guests. There was a lemon pie cooling on the window ledge. Mark always loved lemon pie. His unit Echo Company had flown in from all over the country to visit me, something they'd done once a year since his funeral. The house was quiet, solemn, and warm. These dinners were my way of keeping a part of Mark alive. But that day, Karen didn't just fine me. She made sure the entire neighborhood knew I was violating the HOA social conduct clause. I found out she'd emailed the entire board and CC'd the neighborhood mailing list, attaching a photo she'd taken through my fence of the men arriving in uniform. I'll never forget her words at the HOA meeting that followed. Elise has every right to grieve, but not at the expense of the community's safety. We don't know who these men are. Some of them had bronze stars. One had a prosthetic leg. They sat through that meeting, quiet, straight-backed, hands folded the same way they would have at attention. Karen never looked them in the eye. I was humiliated, angry, and heartbroken. The fine wasn't just about money. It was about erasing my connection to the only people who understood my loss. But I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just looked at her and said, "You're making a mistake." Because I had something Karen didn't, patience. And before I tell you what happened on that day in court, when Karen finally saw what it feels like to be powerless, let me explain how it all began. Before Karen moved in and turned the HOA into her personal courtroom, my home was a sanctuary not just for me, but for Mark's brothers in arms. I bought the house with Mark back in 2003, just before his second deployment. It was modest, a 2-story brick colonial, tucked at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in Lakewood Preserve. Back then, the HOA was nothing more than a seasonal newsletter and the occasional reminder to mow your lawn. Mark and I loved the place. He built the backyard deck himself during his post-deployment leave. It had a built-in grill and wide wooden steps leading down to the garden beds, where I grew tomatoes and rosemary. He used to joke that he was building the post-war BBQ HQ. I laughed, even though I hated that phrase, post-war. I didn't want to think about what might come between us and those late afternoons together. He didn't make it back from his 3rd deployment. His convoy hit an IED outside Ramadi. I got the knock on the door I had feared 4 years. That was 16 years ago. I thought the silence would destroy me. I was 36, widowed, childless, and drowning in grief. But something unexpected happened at Mark's funeral. One by one, his unit stepped forward. They held my hand, shared stories, cried with me. I realized that I wasn't alone. A few months later, I invited a few of them over for dinner. I made the lasagna Mark loved. We sat out back under the string lights he'd stapled up one summer. That night became a ritual. Every year around the anniversary of his death, I'd host whoever could make it. Sometimes 5 men showed up, sometimes 10. They'd sleep in the guest rooms on the couch or pitch tents in the backyard like it was a recon bivouac. We'd drink whiskey and sit around the fire pit swapping stories, most of them about Mark. Some funny, some heart-wrenching. Not once in those 15 years did a neighbor complain. In fact, many would wave or send a quick thank you note for the service your husband gave. The HOA stayed quiet, even supportive, until Karen moved in. She arrived 2 years ago, all sharp sunglasses and tighter than necessary yoga pants, strutting around like she'd inherited the neighborhood. I first met her when she knocked on my door and handed me a packet of HOA rule amendments. She said she was proposing for community refinement. This neighborhood could be so much more, she said, peering into my foyer like she was assessing a real estate listing. I have a vision. She ran for HOA president that fall and won in a vote that barely anyone showed up for. Most of the old board was made up of retirees who were just happy someone else wanted the job. Karen immediately started reworking the bylaws, enforcing obscure clauses, and introducing noise ordinances. At first, I kept my head down. I figured if I stayed polite and quiet, she'd lose interest. But I started noticing her walking past my house a little too often, sometimes, stopping to jot notes on a clipboard. One afternoon, I saw her standing at the edge of my driveway, taking photos of my backyard. When I asked her what she was doing, she smiled without warmth. just updating property compliance records. That was the first chill. Then came the friendly warnings. A note about trash cans not being rolled in within the hour. A complaint about the improper positioning of a garden gnome. She once warned me that my rosemary bush was encroaching on a shared sidewalk space. Still, I said nothing. I thought maybe she was just trying too hard. I didn't want a feud. But everything changed after last year's memorial dinner. It was the first one we'd hosted since COVID lockdowns ended. I was excited, even nervous. I'd spent the whole week cleaning, cooking, getting the guest rooms ready. 10 of Mark's old friends were flying in. Some I hadn't seen in 5 or 6 years. The night went beautifully. We lit a fire, passed around Mark's favorite scotch, and toasted under the stars. One of the guys, Rico, read a poem he'd written for Mark. We laughed and cried until 2 in the morning. Then came the fine, $2,000, hand-delivered by Karen herself the next morning, with her lips pressed into a self-righteous smile. I read the citation 3 times before I even understood what I was looking at. She had invoked some arcane clause about unauthorized assembly of non-residents, posing security concern, and exceeding permitted backyard noise thresholds after dusk. You can't be serious, I said, still in my robe, blinking at the paperwork. She tilted her head like she was teaching a kindergartner to read. At least this isn't about your loss, it's about order. We have rules here. She handed me a second envelope, a threat of legal escalation if I didn't pay the fine, and cease all such future gatherings. I won't let you turn this community into a campsite for unstable veterans. That's when I realized Karen wasn't just cold. She was dangerous, and she had just made the worst mistake of her HOA career. The next few weeks were suffocating. The air around my house changed. It wasn't just Karen anymore. It was the way people looked at me as they walked by. Some wouldn't wave like they used to. Others, the longtime neighbors who once brought me pies after Mark's funeral, suddenly seemed distant. One woman crossed the street when she saw me raking leaves. Karen's emails became relentless. I received 3 more citations in 2 weeks. One accused me of violating lawn ornament height restrictions. Another insisted the American flag I flew from my porch was too large and not HOA compliant. And the last, the one that made my hands shake, included printed photos of my backyard fire pit with the caption, "Repeat fire hazard violation." The photo was clearly taken at night. She had been out there, probably crouched behind her hedge, photographing my home while we mourned and remembered. But the worst wasn't the fines or the photos. It was what she said at the next HOA meeting. Karen stood at the front of the clubhouse room, the fluorescent lights buzzing above her hair, pinned into a tight bun like she was hosting a press conference. She had a slideshow cued on the wall behind her as if she was about to unveil plans for a luxury resort. This next issue, she said, clicking to a slide labeled "Unauthorized Veterans Assembly," has caused multiple disturbances. She clicked again. A blurry photo of Rico sitting on my back porch in his marine dress blues. Click. Another of 2 veterans laughing beside the fire pit. Click. One of me hugging someone near the garden. These individuals are not residents. They are guests, many unknown, and their presence constitutes a liability under our bylaws. This sets a precedent we cannot support. The room was quiet. My stomach dropped. She had presented us like we were criminals. Then she added the line that burned into my brain. We all respect Elisa's loss, but grief doesn't grant immunity from rules. We are not a halfway house. I left the meeting. I didn't speak. I didn't cry. I went home and sat at the edge of Mark's deck, staring into the rosemary bush he'd once called his secret stake weapon. That night, I sent out a message to everyone who'd ever attended one of the memorial dinners. I thanked them. I told them what was happening. And then I asked a simple question. Do you think I'm wrong to keep honoring him like this? By morning, I had over 30 replies. Some were long and angry. Others were short and quietly supportive. But one reply stood out. It was from Isaiah James, a quiet man who had once served under Mark. He was now a civil rights attorney. His message was only 2 sentences long. You're not wrong. Let me know when you're ready to fight. That night, I watched as another letter from Karen slid through my mail slot. The sound of it hitting the floor made my skin crawl. I didn't even open it. Instead, I picked up the phone. Isaiah said, "Let's do it." We met the next morning at a diner halfway across town. He came with a folder already thick with printed bylaws, annotated clauses, and copies of every fine and email I had forwarded to him. This isn't about zoning or ordinances, he said, his voice calm but deadly serious. This is harassment under the guise of policy enforcement. And when veterans are being targeted, it edges into civil rights territory. He asked if I'd be willing to go public, to file a suit, to possibly lose, but lose loudly. Karen's banking on you being quiet, he said. Let's make some noise instead. I nodded. For the first time since the first fine showed up, I felt like I could breathe. Then Isaiah leaned in and added something else. We'll start with a cease and desist. But before we file the harassment suit, I want to look into her. People like her rarely stop at one target. He was right. Within a week, we uncovered stories. Karen had fined a black family for excessive vehicle presence when they hosted a reunion, something that never happened to white homeowners down the street. She had cited a single father for allowing his teenage son to play basketball in the driveway. She had blocked a mobility ramp permit for an elderly veteran neighbor because it wasn't architecturally consistent. Isaiah was building a pattern. Meanwhile, Karen wasn't slowing down. She escalated. She emailed the neighborhood claiming I was pursuing legal intimidation tactics. She suggested I was leveraging my status as a widow to silence rightful HOA authority. The email ended with, "This community cannot bow to one woman's narrative. We all deserve peace." That was the last straw for a few neighbors. One of them, a quiet man named Carl, who'd lived 2 doors down for 20 years, came to my door with a folded lawn chair under his arm. "Mind if I sit on your porch?" he asked. I figure if I'm already violating HOA bylaws, might as well do it with company. The next night, 2 more neighbors joined. By the weekend, there were 5. They brought coffee, folding chairs, stories, and quiet support. Karen hated it. Karen, she walked by each night pretending to jog her pace just a little too fast, her face a little too smug. But she knew something was shifting. The woman she thought she could quietly bulldoze was about to take her apart in broad daylight. I wish I could say filing the lawsuit gave me immediate relief, like flipping a switch from powerless to powerful. But the truth is things got worse before they got better. The day after the cease and desist was served, Karen didn't waste a minute. She filed a formal HOA complaint accusing me of retaliatory behavior and hostile disruption of board operations. That same evening, I received an official notice taped to my door. I was being referred to the HOA disciplinary panel for a hearing regarding conduct unbecoming of a homeowner. The wording made me laugh bitterly. What did that even mean, unbecoming? For feeding grieving Marines lemon pie? That hearing was held in the small, windowless clubhouse meeting room where we used to host garden potlucks and birthday parties back before Karen's reign. Now it felt like a tribunal. Karen sat at the end of a long table, arms folded, eyes gleaming with smug authority. 2 board members, both of whom I'd once shared Christmas cookies with, flanked her like timid lieutenants. She read the complaint aloud like it was a prosecution's closing argument. She accused me of violating community trust, of inciting division, and most insultingly, of weaponizing grief for personal indulgence. I almost couldn't breathe when she said that. I locked eyes with her, stunned, but her expression didn't even flicker. "I'd like to recommend at least be placed on a 6-month probation," Karen concluded, "during which no guest events or outdoor assemblies be permitted on her property." Isaiah stood up slowly and leaned forward, voice calm but seething. "This isn't a hearing. This is a performance. You have no legal standing to restrict a homeowner's First Amendment rights or impose sanctions not supported by actual statute." Karen smiled like she'd been waiting for that. "Then perhaps we'll let the judge decide," she said. "You're not the only one preparing legal action." And that's how I found out Karen was suing me for defamation and intentional emotional distress. The legal bills piled up fast. Isaiah took my case pro bono, but the filings alone required thousands in administrative fees. I started picking up substitute teaching work and renting out my guest room on weekends to cover the expenses. I was exhausted emotionally, financially, and spiritually. The house felt less like a home and more like a battleground. Worse, the veterans began to back away. Not because they didn't care. They cared deeply, but because they saw the weight I was carrying. They didn't want to make it worse. Rico called me one night and said, "Elise, we can meet somewhere else. Don't let us be the reason you lose your house." I cried that night, quietly, alone. But then something happened I didn't expect. One of the board members, Carol, came to my door. She looked nervous, holding a reusable grocery bag full of store-bought cookies. "I shouldn't be here," she said quickly, "but I wanted you to know I'm sorry. Karen, she's out of control. I voted for you in that meeting." The others were scared. "She's been threatening to file complaints against anyone who opposes her." She handed me a USB drive. "It's from the last few meetings. I started recording them after she censored the minutes. You might need it." That little flash drive lit a fire under Isaiah. He called me within hours of reviewing it. There's more than enough here to support retaliation and abuse of authority. She's been using HOA resources for personal vendettas. That same week, I began to notice something else. Karen had installed a new motion-activated security camera on her front porch, one that pointed directly at my driveway. A few days later, she left a voicemail for the police accusing one of my guests of intimidating, posturing near her mailbox. The officer who came to speak with me was polite, even apologetic. Between you and me, Ms. Hammond, we've gotten 5 calls from her this month, all of them targeting you or someone you're with. He sighed. I've got a veteran brother. What she's doing, it doesn't sit right. I thanked him and gave him a warm drink for the road. Then I sat down at my kitchen table, stared at my rosemary bush, and made a decision. I wasn't just going to defend myself, I was going to go after her. We officially filed the harassment and discrimination suit 2 weeks later. Isaiah's civil rights firm brought in additional counsel. A coalition of local veteran support groups signed on to issue public statements. And when news of the lawsuit hit the local paper, everything changed. People who had avoided me before now waved. A few even dropped off casseroles. And one brave teenage girl whom I didn't know rang my bell and handed me a card that said, "My uncle's a vet. Thanks for standing up." But perhaps the most surprising shift came from the neighborhood Facebook group, usually a place for lost dogs and garage sale announcements. That night, someone anonymously posted the full story complete with HOA meeting recordings. The post went viral within the neighborhood. Karen tried to delete it. Then she tried to shut the group down. But someone had already saved and reposted everything on a public forum. By the next morning, 3 more homeowners reached out to Isaiah, each with their own horror story involving Karen. One even accused her of selectively fining non-white residents and purposefully obstructing permit requests for families with children. Karen's facade was cracking. She had spent years controlling this place with fierce silence and bureaucracy. But now the silence was broken. And in that rising noise, the kind that scared people like her most, I found something I hadn't felt in a long time. Momentum. The breaking point came not with a bang, but with the whisper of a letter slid under my door. It was early, just after sunrise. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a steaming cup of black tea, staring out the window at the rosemary bush that had grown wild despite Karen's many complaints. I watched the steam rise from the cup and curl like breath in the morning chill. Then came the soft shuffle of paper slipping against the hardwood floor. I didn't even need to look. Karen's paper trail had become as familiar to me as the lines on my palms. I picked it up. Plain white envelope, no return address. Inside was a letterhead stamped HOA Compliance Action Notice. The contents made my chest tighten. Effective immediately, your property is under review for potential covenant violations warranting lien placement. Failure to resolve within 30 days may result in legal seizure. That was it. No itemized violations, no explanation, just a threat. A loin on my house. The same house Mark and I had bought as newlyweds. The one I refinanced to pay off his medical bills. The one I had filled with the laughter of his brothers, the smell of grilled steak, and the quiet warmth of memory. Karen wasn't just playing petty games anymore. She was trying to take the last piece of him I had left. And that's when I stood up slow and cold and felt the shift inside me. There was no more room for fear, no more space for hesitation. Karen had declared war. I called Isaiah. He was already awake reviewing discovery documents for the civil suit. I just got a lien threat, I said. She's trying to take my house. Silence on the line for a second, then we're going nuclear. He explained what that meant. See, so far, we'd been following a careful line, pursuing harassment, discrimination, abuse of authority. But now, with the lien threat, we could file a counterclaim for malicious prosecution and fraudulent misuse of HOA enforcement mechanisms. And we wouldn't be alone. Isaiah had quietly built a coalition. 5 other neighbors had agreed to co-sign affidavits. 2 were willing to testify in court. 1 was already drafting a petition for Karen's removal. But Isaiah had something else, something I didn't expect. A whistleblower. One of the board members, a man named Greg, who had worked alongside Karen for over a year, had flipped. He showed up at my house one night with a folder full of printed emails and text screenshots. "She forced us to target you," he said. "She said if we didn't go along, she'd report us to the state for fiduciary mismanagement." The folder was gold. In it were written confirmations that Karen had knowingly pushed false fines, forged timestamps on complaint letters, and the cherry on top, authorized surveillance on me, using HOA funds for what she called behavioral pattern documentation. Isaiah's legal team moved fast. By the end of the week, we filed an emergency injunction to stop any liens from being placed and added Greg's documents to the lawsuit. But that wasn't enough for me. I wanted Karen to feel what I'd felt, the powerlessness, the isolation, the slow humiliation of being judged by your own neighbors. So I did something small but bold. I threw a backyard barbecue. Not a veteran dinner. Just ribbed sweet tea jazz music and about 20 neighbors who for the first time in months didn't pretend not to see me. The air was light, even joyous. Children ran through the grass. Two of the older gentlemen sat on the steps and debated the best way to make brisket. And I smiled not because everything was fixed, but because Karen would see it and she could do nothing. She called the cops, of course. But when the officer arrived and asked what was going on, I handed him a plate of ribs and the injunction paperwork. He chuckled, tipped his cap, and left. Later that night, I stood in the yard as the last of the guests left, and I looked over toward Karen's house. Her blinds were open, just a crack. She was watching. Good. Let her. The next day, her lawyers tried to push for a settlement. They knew we had her not just legally, but publicly. The neighborhood was turning. People who'd once been silent were speaking up. But I said no. Karen didn't get to walk away with a slap on the wrist. She tried to erase my husband's memory, tried to poison the last piece I had. She was going to lose everything she built on control. And I wasn't stopping until the gavel dropped. If Karen thought she could bully me into silence, she underestimated what a widow can become after she's already lost everything. Isaiah's team doubled down. They pulled in a civil liberties watchdog group and a veteran legal defense fund. Overnight, my case wasn't just mine anymore. It had become a cause. The group issued a formal statement to the press targeting gatherings of military veterans under the guise of HOA compliance is not only petty, it's unconstitutional. And then something remarkable happened. Local news picked up the story. The reporter was young, clearly fresh out of school, but she had fire in her. She interviewed me on my porch, framed by the rosemary bush and the weather-worn flagpole. I told my story plainly, no tears, no dramatics, just the truth. They weren't parties, I said into the camera. They were remembrance dinners. And Karen tried to erase my husband's legacy with a rule book. The segment aired that night. I went to bed not expecting much. The next morning, I woke to over 100 emails. Some were from strangers, veterans, widows, military families across the country. One stood out, a message from a retired federal judge who just so happened to live in the next neighborhood over. He'd seen the segment. He offered to file an amicus brief in support of the suit, citing gross procedural abuse by a governing body. Isaiah was elated. But we didn't stop there. Karen had tried to bury me under her rules, so we buried her in paper. Discovery requests, subpoenas, depositions. We filed for access to all internal HOA communications over the last 3 years. Karen's carefully groomed image began to collapse under the weight of her own arrogance. At her deposition, she arrived in a power suit, lips painted the color of entitlement, clutching a folder stuffed with nothing but printed copies of my Facebook posts, as if a post about missing Mark today was grounds for litigation. Isaiah played her gently. He asked her about HOA protocol, complaint logs, decision processes. Then, without warning, he dropped Greg's email printouts onto the table. This email, Isaiah said, tapping the highlighted sentence where you say, "Elise is emotionally unstable and must be pushed out through pressure. Use fines creatively." Did you write this? Karen froze. She looked at her attorney, who gave the smallest, slowest nod. Yes, she said finally, but it was taken out of context. Isaiah leaned back in his chair. And what about this one? He held up a printed text. Target her gatherings. Veterans make people uncomfortable. It's not the image I want for this community. That's your phone number. That's your HOA-issued device. Context. Karen's voice dropped an octave. That was a private message. The moment you use HOA resources and authority to act on it, privacy went out the window. Isaiah replied. It was like watching a porcelain mask crack down the middle. You could hear the fracture forming in the silence of that room. From that point on, Karen unraveled quickly. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. Over half the neighborhood attended something that hadn't happened in years. One brave homeowner, a mother of two, stood up and read Karen's emails aloud for all to hear. The room buzzed with outrage. When Karen walked in halfway through, people turned to look at her like she was a ghost. A motion was raised. A vote was cast. The board unanimously removed Karen as president. 2 members resigned. A third offered a tearful apology to the community and to me. But that wasn't the end. Not yet, because the civil trial still stood, and Karen still refused to settle. Her pride wouldn't let her, so we took it to court. And there in a modest courtroom with flickering lights and tired jurors, we laid out the entire story. Not just mine, but everyone Karen had bullied under the flag of order. We showed the emails. We showed the patterns. We showed the fear she had sown in a community that had once been kind. And we showed the humanity of what she tried to destroy. Veterans, grief, love. When the jury left the room to deliberate, my hands trembled. Isaiah just leaned over and whispered, "No matter what happens, you fought." But what happened was more than I could have hoped. The jury found in our favor on all counts. The court awarded $140,000 in damages. Karen was ordered to sell her home to cover the judgment. She sat frozen when the verdict was read. Not a tear, not a word, just that same rigid expression she wore the day she handed me the first fine, except now the power was gone. Her kingdom of paper and threats had turned to ash. I walked out of that courtroom lighter, not elated, just steady. Karen had tried to take my sanctuary. But in trying to silence me, she gave me something else. A voice, a reason, and a fire that wouldn't go out. The months after the verdict moved in strange, quiet rhythms. Not because things had slowed down, quite the opposite, but because the chaos no longer felt like it was clinging to my skin. Karen put her house on the market less than 3 weeks after the court order. She didn't attend the open house, didn't say goodbye. One day she was there, and the next morning the windows were dark, the blinds pulled shut, the for sale sign already listing as if it had given up too. And yet, even with the legal victory, even with her gone, I wasn't satisfied. Not in a vengeful way. I didn't want to haunt her. I wanted to outlive her, outlast her, build something in the space she'd tried so hard to poison. Something no one could tear down with a fine or a bylaw. I spent a long night walking the property line between our homes. The fence, once a neutral divider, now felt like a scar. I stood in the backyard, the same yard where my husband's friends had laughed, cried, and drank under the stars, and looked at her empty house. The porch lights were still on, but the soul was gone. Then the idea came to me, a retreat. Not a facility, not a program, a home for veterans, for their spouses, for the kind of quiet, dignified remembrance that Karen tried to erase. I called Isaiah the next morning and asked him how complicated it would be to buy her house. He paused. Through a trust? Not complicated. Through you directly might be messy. Why? I want to make it a place for good, I said. Something permanent. He didn't ask another question. Just said, give me a week. Within days, he had established a nonprofit trust. The name came to me like a whisper. Camp Echo House. A nod to Mark's unit Echo Company and the idea that voices, when they're strong enough, don't just fade. They echo through people, through time, through places. The house went up for auction. I didn't attend in person. The trust's attorney handled everything. The bid wasn't high. After the judgment, Karen had no bargaining power left. The home sold under market value. And just like that, her house became mine. No, it became ours. The first renovation wasn't structural. It was symbolic. I dug up the cold gray paving stones Karen had laid out front, the ones that led to her massive private entry garden, and replaced them with stepping stones engraved with the names of veterans from Echo Company. Rico came to help. So did Isaiah. So did Carol, the former board member, and Carl, my porch companion from that strange, quiet protest so many weeks before. We painted the walls soft greens and blues. We filled the guest rooms with quilts, some of them donated by military widows from across the state. I mounted Mark's medals in a shadow box and hung it in the main hallway. It wasn't about reliving pain. It was about giving it a place to breathe, to sit quietly in a sunlit room and just be without judgment, without policy, without shame. The first guest was a Navy vet named Anthony, who had been through 3 divorces and was trying to reconnect with his daughter. He stayed for 3 nights, wrote letters every morning from the breakfast nook, and left a small handwritten note in the guest book. This house gave me a heartbeat again. The second was a woman named Lori, a former combat medic who hadn't slept a full night in years. She emailed me 2 weeks after her stay. "It's the rosemary," she wrote. I sat beside it and finally cried. I think that's a good thing. Donations started pouring in, and with them stories. People who had been silenced or shamed by HOA's institutions, neighbors they started sharing. Not just about veterans, but about their own personal little wars. I began holding monthly storytelling dinners. Sometimes it was just 5 of us, sometimes 20. We laughed, we wept, we passed around ribs and sweet tea like it was communion. And all the while, the neighborhood watched. At first, I saw the curtains twitch, the hesitant stares, the slow, suspicious glances. Then came the knocks, the tentative, "Can I help with anything?" offers, and eventually the emails. One woman wrote, "I believe Karen. I'm sorry, I was wrong." Another said, "My father was a Marine. I never stood up for you, and I regret it." But the moment I knew the tide had turned came from an unexpected place. The HOA board, now under entirely new leadership, sent me a formal letter. It was short. "We hereby recognize Camp Echo House as a valuable addition to our community and exempt from all residential gathering limitations per Article 4 revision. Thank you for showing us what community truly means." No fines, no veiled threats, just acknowledgement. I stood on my porch that day and ran my fingers through the overgrown rosemary bush, feeling the oils on my skin, breathing in that stubborn, fragrant resilience. Karen had once tried to reduce my grief to a violation code, but now everything she tried to destroy had become something untouchable, something permanent. If Karen's downfall had ended in the courtroom, that might have been enough. But life has a poetic way of letting justice unfold layer by layer until even the shadows feel brighter. 3 months after I opened Camp Echo House, I was invited to speak at a local veterans symposium. It was held at the Civic Center downtown, not far from the courthouse, where Karen once tried to dismantle my dignity with legalese and pettiness. This time, though, I stood on a stage with a microphone in my hand, looking out at rows of people, old soldiers, spouses, counselors, city officials, not one of them with a clipboard or a citation pad. I spoke calmly the way I always had. No fanfare, just the truth. I was fined for hosting dinner for my husband's unit, I said. I was threatened with lawsuits and liens. But I didn't back down, not because I'm brave, but because I was tired of being small. The applause was steady, respectful, and warm, but what came next I never expected. A woman stood during the Q&A. Her hair was short, her eyes heavy with something familiar. She asked, "Do you believe what happened to you is still happening in other neighborhoods?" I answered without hesitation. Yes, every day, in different ways. And it's time we stop pretending rules are more important than people. After the symposium, a state representative approached me. She'd been quietly following my story. She asked if I'd be willing to help advise on new legislation focused on HOA reform, specifically targeting overreach and discrimination. I blinked, surprised. "You're serious?" She smiled. "Dead serious. We need faces like yours behind the bill." In that moment, I realized Karen hadn't just handed me a house through her arrogance. She'd handed me a platform. Back in Lakewood Preserve, the ripple effect continued. The new HOA board, with Carol now serving as president, began revising the community charter. The language was rewritten to center fairness, accessibility, and resident input. Public votes were now mandatory for any enforcement change. Anonymous complaints were no longer accepted. All meetings were open and recorded. A community that once cowered behind blinds now gathered on porches and gardens at neighborhood cleanup days. Camp Echo became a kind of hub, not officially but naturally. People dropped off baked goods, volunteer hours, and lawn chairs. It started to feel like a neighborhood again. Then one quiet Saturday, Carl, my old porch buddy, showed up with a crooked smile and a surprise in his arms. It was the gnome. The garden gnome Karen had once cited me for improper placement, claiming it was visible from the street and lowered property value. I laughed when I saw it. He'd painted a tiny Marine Corps emblem on the gnome's helmet. Someone had even added a tiny rosemary sprig glued to his backpack. We planted him right near the front steps of Echo House, a silent, grinning sentinel to everything we had built. But the best moment, the true satisfying reversal, came 6 weeks later, when Karen's name surfaced again. It appeared on a flyer for a new HOA position in another town 2 counties over. She was applying for the board president's seat in a newly developed community. I kept the flyer on my fridge for 2 days. Then I passed it to Isaiah with a smirk. "Should we warn them?" He smiled. "Already did." Turns out Karen hadn't disclosed the court judgment on her application. When the developers reached out to verify her record, Isaiah provided the public lawsuit file complete with the emails, the ruling, and the ethics complaint she'd earned in the process. Her application was quietly withdrawn. She faded out of the headlines, but I doubt she ever forgot me. As for me, I kept living slowly, steadily. Camp Echo became a retreat, a meeting space, a refuge. We installed a fire pit out back, not the old one, but a new one built by the hands of veterans and neighbors who showed up one Saturday morning with shovels, bricks, and coolers of lemonade. We lit it that night. I stood near the flames, surrounded by laughter music, and the low hum of peace finally won. And I thought about Karen, not with hate, not even with bitterness, just a strange gratitude. Because in trying to silence me, she gave me a megaphone. In trying to isolate me, she helped me build a family. In trying to erase Mark's memory, she made sure it was etched into every corner of this neighborhood. That was the twist she never saw coming. Fall came early that year, as if the world itself was eager to start over. The leaves in Lakewood Preserve turned brilliant gold and deep red, and for the first time in years, I actually noticed them. I walked my neighborhood with no more sidelong glances, no clipped greetings, no cold shoulders, just the rustle of leaves beneath my boots and the smell of wood smoke curling through the air from backyards that were finally truly lived in. But while I had moved on, Karen hadn't. She tried to appeal the court's decision, not out of hope, but out of spite. Her new lawyer, a man who probably charged more for a phone call than I'd paid for my entire deck, filed a motion citing emotional duress, character defamation, and reputation loss. The court reviewed it in less than an hour and tossed it out with a single sentence, no merit found. Still, the fallout continued. HOA boards across the county took note. Karen's name became a cautionary tale. One local HOA organization even held a seminar titled Community Governance versus Personal Agenda Lessons from the Hammond Case. Her tactics were dissected, mocked, and ultimately rejected as everything a neighborhood leader shouldn't be. She was effectively blacklisted from any future board positions. And not just locally. Her online reputation, once spotless, thanks to carefully curated LinkedIn posts and a smug next-door presence, was now stained with headlines and public court documents. Isaiah called me one day after a journalist reached out to him. She wants to do a piece called When HOAs Go Too Far, he said. Wants to highlight you. You interested? I considered it. For a moment, it was tempting, the idea of telling the story to a national audience, putting the final nail in the coffin. But I surprised him. No, I said, let someone else tell their version. I've told mine. Because the truth was, I didn't need more spotlight. I had already won in all the ways that mattered. Camp Echo House was thriving. We'd hosted 15 veterans in just under 4 months, and more were coming every week. I started getting calls from VA coordinators, therapists, even local college professors asking if they could visit or volunteer. One afternoon, I stood at the stove stirring a pot of chili for a small group of visitors. 2 Marines, 1 Army vet, and a Gold Star mom from Oregon who had driven down to see the house that shook the system. Outside, laughter spilled through the windows. Someone had started a game of touch football in the yard. Someone else was tuning an old acoustic guitar on the porch. The joy was messy, loud, imperfect. It was life exactly as it should be. And then came the most unexpected moment of all. Carol, the new HOA president, stopped by with a small package. No clipboard, no formality, just her and a paper-wrapped box. I thought you might want this, she said softly. Inside was the original nameplate from Karen's mailbox. The one that had once glinted like a badge of power in the sun. Carson, board president. Carol had removed it herself during renovations of the HOA office. She smiled at me gently. You can toss it or keep it. I just thought you should be the one to decide. I held it for a long moment. Then I walked it out to the Camp Echo garden, the space behind the house where we'd planted rosemary, lavender, and wild mint. And with a little hand spade, I buried the nameplate right at the base of Mark's memorial tree. No gravestone, no ceremony, just the end of an era. A symbol laid to rest in the shadow of a life it had tried and failed to dominate. In the weeks that followed, the energy of the neighborhood changed. A kind of soft humility filled the air. Neighbors began meeting each other again. Front porches became gathering places. And rules, the reasonable ones, were respected not because of fear, but because we chose them together. One afternoon, as I was trimming the rosemary bush that had somehow doubled in size since Karen's last complaint, I heard the faint sound of children laughing. 2 kids were running down the sidewalk, waving miniature flags, one red, one blue. Their parents followed a few paces behind, holding hands and smiling. They paused when they saw me. You're Elise, right? The mother asked. The one who built this place? I nodded. Thank you, she said. We were nervous about moving here. We heard about everything. But it's good now. It feels like home. It was a simple statement, but it struck something deep. Because that's what this whole fight had been about from the beginning. Home. Not just the physical space, but what it meant to be known. To be respected. to have the freedom to grieve, to gather, to remember without fear. And as I stood there, shears in hand, rosemary clippings at my feet, I realized the legacy wasn't in the lawsuit or the news articles or the judgment. It was in the soil, the walls, the fire pit, the laughter, the healed wounds. Karen had fallen, but something much greater had risen in her place. Something rooted, something real. Peace, when it finally arrived, didn't make a grand entrance. It didn't announce itself with a parade or a closing argument. It came in quiet moments in silence that no longer felt oppressive, in mornings that didn't begin with dread. I found myself waking up without the weight in my chest, the one that had sat there for so long, I'd almost forgotten it didn't belong. I could walk past the HOA office without a spike of anxiety, drive into my own driveway without checking for strange cars or new citations pinned to my door. I was no longer looking over my shoulder. For the first time in years, I was simply living. I took up gardening again. Not just herbs full flowers. Mark always wanted me to plant roses, said they reminded him of the ones that grew wild outside his grandmother's farmhouse. I had resisted for years, joking I didn't have the patience. But one Saturday, I found myself at the nursery cradling a small potted rose bush with trembling fingers. I planted it in the front yard right where Karen once stood with her clipboard and cold eyes measuring my lawn height. The irony wasn't lost on me. Roses of all things. Camp Echo House continued to grow. Not in size, but in presence. It became part of the fabric of the neighborhood. People began referring to it casually. Oh, that's down by Echo House, or we're doing the community cookout over at Echo. It no longer needed explanation. I hosted Thanksgiving there that year. Not just for veterans, but for anyone in the neighborhood who didn't have family nearby. We set out folding tables, strung lights from the porch to the fence line, and roasted 2 massive turkeys. The air was filled with laughter, conversation, the clink of glasses, and the occasional burst of music from someone's speaker. I remember standing at the edge of the deck, a mug of cider in hand, watching it all unfold. Rico was helping a little boy carve his plate. Carol was dancing with her husband under the twinkle lights. Carl sat at the fire pit telling a story that made 3 people spit their drinks in laughter. I didn't feel like the widow anymore. I felt like the anchor. The lawsuits, the fights, the fear, they were still part of me. But they no longer defined me. They had become pages in a story, not the whole book. Even Isaiah, who had spent so many months in legal war beside me, had softened. He started bringing his wife and daughter by for weekend dinners. His little girl loved the garden. She picked mint leaves and handed them to me like treasure. "You're strong," she said once unprompted, looking up at me with big brown eyes. "Daddy says you beat the bad guys." I smiled, kneeling in the dirt beside her. "I didn't beat them, sweetie. I just reminded them I wasn't afraid." Sometimes that's all it takes. Fear is what they count on. Fear of speaking up, fear of rocking the boat, fear of being the one who makes trouble. Karen had ruled through that fear inch by inch, fine by fine, glance by glance. But fear had no place here anymore. The final piece of that truth settled in when a young couple moved into Karen's old house. Newlyweds. The wife, Jenna, was a social worker. The husband, Trevor, was Army Reserve. When they came to introduce themselves, they brought homemade bread and nervous smiles. "We hope we're not intruding," Jenna said. "We've heard about everything." I laughed genuinely. "You're not intruding, you're continuing." They asked if they could volunteer at Echo House. Of course I said yes. Within weeks, they were part of the rhythm. Trevor helped mow the lawn. Jenna led a grief support circle on Tuesdays. That house, her house, was full of life again. That was my closure. Not her leaving, but someone good moving in. Someone who watered the same soil she once poisoned and watched it bloom. Peace didn't come from revenge. It came from reclamation. From taking back the space, the voice, the dignity that had been stolen and planting something in its place. Something stronger. Something unshakable. And in that stillness, I found something else I thought I'd lost forever. Joy. It's strange how legacy can take root in places you once thought were ruined. Camp Echo House didn't just survive. It became something bigger than I ever imagined. The project grew beyond the neighborhood, beyond me. What started as a quiet act of resistance evolved into a living memorial, not only to Mark, but to everyone who's ever had their dignity threatened behind white picket fences and smile through your teeth neighborly rules. The following spring, we held a ceremony. Nothing grand, just a gathering of people who had been part of the journey. Veterans, widows, neighbors, a few journalists, even a city councilwoman who had supported the HOA reform bill that passed that March, a bill that required all HOAs in the state to undergo annual audits and banned the use of anonymous complaints as the basis for punitive action. They called it the Hammond provision. I didn't ask for that, but I didn't fight it either. The councilwoman gave a short speech that day. She said what started as a petty citation became a movement for transparency. This place, Camp Echo House, proves that the strongest communities are built not on fear or power, but on empathy. I stood beside the new rose bushes, 3 of them now, each one named for someone we lost, and thanked everyone in my own words. I'm not a politician. I'm not a hero. I'm just a widow who loved her husband and wanted to keep his memory alive. Karen tried to take that from me, and in fighting back, I found all of you. So this house, this space belongs to all of us now. We unveiled the plaque that day. It stands at the edge of the garden under a wide oak tree. Bronze, sturdy, simple. Camp Echo House, a place to remember to rebuild and to rest. In honor of Sergeant Mark Hammond and every voice silenced too soon. Below it, a single line etched in smaller print. Let them try. We'll still be here. We ended the day with a dinner under the stars, just like the ones Mark used to imagine when he talked about our future. There was chili cornbread and lemon pie. Rico read a new poem. Isaiah made a toast. Even Carl sang badly but with gusto, and no one minded. The lights twinkled overhead. Children laughed in the grass. Somewhere in the background, a dog barked and a record player skipped slightly between songs. It was messy, real, full of life, and it was mine. Karen's name hasn't been spoken around here in months. Not out of fear, but because she simply isn't relevant anymore. Her absence became her legacy, not the dominance she craved. But Mark is everywhere. In the smell of rosemary and lemon zest. In the laughter echoing through the porch rafters. In the hand-carved bench out front where neighbors now stop just to sit and breathe. And in every letter we receive from veterans who've stayed and left a piece of their healing behind. This story didn't end with revenge. It ended with a home reclaimed, a community awakened, and a legacy built not out of spite, but from love. Because when you plant something in scorched earth, it doesn't just grow. It proves that it can. And that's all I ever wanted. Looking back now, I don't see myself as the woman who fought the HOA and won. That's not the real story. The real story is that I found a way to carry my grief without letting it be stolen from me. That I stood up not just for my own peace, but for the peace of others, especially those who've carried burdens far heavier than fines or threats. Mark taught me a lot in the short time we had. About loyalty, about quiet strength, about doing the right thing even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. He didn't come home, but he never really left either. Every kind gesture in Camp Echo, every new bloom in the garden, every moment of laughter or stillness in this house, it's all him. I used to think legacy was something carved in stone, a name on a wall, a folded flag in a shadow box. But now I know the truth. Legacy lives in the choices we make when no one's watching, in the people we lift up when no one else will, in the spaces we protect not with fences, but with intention. Karen tried to define me with rules and restrictions. She underestimated what love and loss can turn into when someone refuses to stay silent. She thought she could erase me with power. But all she did was give me the fire to build something permanent. Camp Echo House will outlive both of us. Long after the bylaws change again. Long after the headlines fade. Long after my voice stops telling this story. There will be someone walking through the rosemary garden. Someone sitting by the fire pit. Someone writing a letter at the breakfast nook window, and they'll feel safe. They'll feel heard. And they'll never know the name Karen. But they'll know what it means to belong. That's the real victory. That's the real legacy. About 6 months after the lawsuit, just when I thought things were finally quieting down, a new situation caught me off guard. It started with a knock on the door, a hesitant one, barely more than a tap. I opened it to find a young man standing there, maybe mid-20s, hair buzzed close, his arms stiff at his sides, like he hadn't yet figured out how to be comfortable. He wore a plain white t-shirt tucked into jeans, and his boots were polished. "Hi," he said. "Are you Mrs. Hammond?" I nodded. He took a breath like he'd been rehearsing what to say. "My name is Daniel. I served with your husband. I was a boot when he was squad leader. I've been trying to come here for a while. I wasn't sure I should." I stepped aside and waved him in. He entered like he was walking onto holy ground. I made tea and we sat on the back porch. Daniel didn't talk at first. He stared at the rosemary bush, then at the fire pit, then back down at his hands. I let the silence hold. Eventually he started speaking slow and careful, like every word had to be tested before he let it go. He told me how Mark had once pulled him out of a burning Humvee. Said Mark had yelled at him like a father chewed him out for not paying attention, then patted his shoulder so hard it bruised. Said it was the only time in his life someone had both saved him and made him feel seen in the same breath. He stayed for dinner. Didn't say much more, but he hugged me on the way out. His shoulders shook slightly. I didn't press him. But 2 weeks later, I saw him again, not at my house, but outside the home of Mrs. Adler, a woman in her 70s who lived alone near the end of the block. Her yard had gone a little wild since her hip surgery, and Daniel was quietly trimming the hedges with her rusty old shears. He looked up when he saw me and shrugged. She said no one else had offered to help. I smiled. He became a regular after that. He volunteered at Camp Echo, helped set up chairs for dinners, fixed the old swing bench out front, even started a weekly walking group for a few older vets who needed the exercise. But slowly I started to notice signs that something was off. Some mornings he would show up with a bright smile full of energy. Other days he would arrive with dark circles under his eyes, barely speaking, hands twitching slightly when he sat still too long. One afternoon I found him sitting on the porch, elbows on his knees, staring out into the garden like it wasn't even there. When I sat beside him and asked gently if he was all right, he answered too quickly. "Fine, just tired." I didn't push that time. But one evening after most of the guests had left and I was sweeping the back porch, I heard shouting. It was Daniel, loud, panicked, and incoherent. I dropped the broom and ran around the side of the house. He was in the backyard, kneeling in the grass, yelling into nothing. "No, no, no, get out, get out, get out!" I reached him slowly, softly. Called his name once, then twice. Finally, his head snapped toward me. His eyes were wild, lost. Then suddenly he seemed to remember where he was. He stood up too fast, backing away, brushing his pants, like he could erase the moment. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "That wasn't supposed to happen." "Daniel," I said, quiet as wind, "do you have someone to talk to?" He shook his head. "The VA's backed up. I got referred 3 months ago. Nothing yet." I wanted to scream, but instead I made a phone call. Rico connected me with a trauma counselor who works specifically with combat vets. She agreed to meet Daniel that weekend off the record. No paperwork, no delays, just someone to listen. Daniel showed up for the appointment, and the next one, and the next. And slowly something shifted. He still had bad days, but now he talked about them. He learned to name what he was feeling. He started a small support circle at Echo House, just 3 or 4 guys, all younger, all struggling in silence the way he had. It became one of the most meaningful parts of the house. They called it the watch post. One day he asked if he could put something on the wall in the side room they used for the meetings. I said yes, without asking what. The next morning I walked in and found it a framed photo of Mark in uniform, and beneath it a brass plaque that read, "He never stopped showing up, neither will we." I stood there for a long time. That was the moment I understood the new chapter of Camp Echo House. Not just a place to remember the past, but a place to live through it. And with Daniel leading those meetings with new young faces showing up each month, that side room began to glow with a quiet kind of hope. It was proof that healing doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small rooms, in late nights, in moments no one else sees. Karen had tried to silence me because she thought grief was weakness. But Daniel taught me something else. Grief is a doorway. And when you open it for others, you find you don't have to walk through alone. That was the gift I never expected. And I'll never forget it.